From Chicago's CAN TV, a look at the week's events is reported in the newspapers, in the blogs and online, and on radio and TV. This is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi there, and welcome to the show for this, the most American of weekends, when we set some time aside to get all introspective and think about this precious gift of liberty and wonder how we'll use that liberty in the coming year. And here's one way a lot of people have used that liberty to get rich or powerful at our expense, specifically here in Chicago, which was recently identified as, come on, everybody all together now, the most corrupt city in America. Well, you know, Dick Simpson and Tom Gradel's new book, Corrupt Illinois, Patronage, Cronyism, Criminality. It can be read a couple of ways, in my opinion. First, it's a kind of a stunning list. I mean, it's almost like a spreadsheet showing breathtaking rosters of crooked politicians and their accomplices and the boodle they sliced out of our hides since back in the Fort Dearborn days. But there's also another. It's the institutionalization of corrupt policies that just kind of seems to be everywhere in our body politic, and not just in Chicago. That foul practice of gerrymandering districts that alone has kind of messed up our politics more than almost anything else, except maybe the overwhelming effect of billionaire money. Well, I just can't wait to ask these guys if all this corruption is, you know, that kind of corruption is just as much as like a corrupt building inspector. So we'll get to that and many more. Guys, thank you so much for being here. It's really a pleasure to have you here.
Glad to be here, Ken.
It's a terrific book, and it's really worth a read. I was telling you just now that one of the real pleasures of this book is somebody who's kind of been in and out of news for whatever it's been, 40 years. You think you know this stuff, and then you go back and you reread it, like Rostenkowski. I don't know. You know, if somebody had said to me, "What happened to Rostenkowski? How did that guy fall?" I'd say, well, there were postage stamps, and there was, but then you sit and read it, and it is an amazing account. That's the document that you've created here.
Right. Rostenkowski's an amazing story because a lot of his corruption was not detected for the longest period of time.
Yeah.
He ended up getting caught by the fact that there was an employee in the post office, the House Post Office, who was involved with drugs.
Yeah.
He got caught and then started talking about the deal he had with Rostenkowski. And Rostenkowski was getting postage stamps legitimately, taking them back to the post office and getting cash, and then using the cash for personal and political means, all right?
So what was it, $20, $30?
It was 50,000 to be
$50,000.
exact.
50,000.
That's a lot of postage stamps.
Over a number of years, right? But he also did other things. He had people on the federal payroll who were cleaning his house and taking care of his vacation home. There's testimony that people that worked for him had on the federal payroll had to kick back money to him through his assistant was there. They operated an office on the 32nd Ward that had the congressman's office, the alderman's office, the committeeman's office, and the Rostenkowski Insurance Company, all in the same office.
One-stop shopping.
And but it was not just that, but they charged the expenses off to the government entities, not to the business entities or to the political entities. So, I mean, there was there were cars that were leased and given to his daughters, but charged to the campaign fund. I mean, there was a whole series of things. And Rostenkowski, his involvement in these illegal, unethical things go way back. And he actually was involved in the racetrack scandal along with Otto Kerner. But the government didn't have any governmental action that he took. He got bargain racetrack stock, just as Otto Kerner did. They didn't have any evidence that he took any action for that, so he wasn't indicted.
When I was running for Congress, Tom and I were tracking 18 different scandals for Rostenkowski, of which the postage stamps was only one, and these others that Tom listed were part of them.
Another thing that had just completely fallen out of my memory was that you ran for that seat.
Almost defeated him, came within 12,000 votes.
I'm embarrassed to say that I had forgotten it, but that's why I say it's such an important document, because it's sort of like there's this reference book where you can go back and see all these things. So here's one of the takeaways that I got from this book. trying to ascertain whether or not there are different levels or kinds of corruption. Okay, we have the crooked building inspector. Writ large, it's Rostenkowski. But then we have, as we're recording this discussion, we've got Denny Hastert, right? Now is Denny Hastert corrupt? Is that what would you include him in your book of corruption?
Yes, but not only because of the indictment. The indictment is that he structured payments of the bank and he lied to the FBI. But Denny Hastert has several other chapters to his life. He passed a bill in Congress that gave $207 million for a Prairie Parkway. Prairie Parkway cut right next to the land which he sold, and he made a $2 million profit. Sold it for $3 million, made $2 million off of it.
And his ownership in that was hidden when the law was passed. It wasn't until afterwards that people found out that he owned that property. He also was involved in a very suspicious action in the House to there was a resolution to recognize the Armenian genocide, and he favored that until in 2002, I believe it was. The resolution was ready to be voted on the floor, and he withdrew it. And he said at the time that he got a letter from President Clinton asking him to withdraw that. And in fact, he did get a letter from President Clinton saying that. But Hastert at that time had voted for the impeachment of Clinton and had voted against almost anything that Clinton wanted. Yeah. There is a report in Vanity Fair that picks up on a whistleblower that says that there are tape recordings of the Turkish consulate here in Chicago that indicated that he got payoffs in order to withdraw that resolution. So that's never been fully investigated. He also, once he left government, he went into lobbying business, and one of his first clients was the Turkish government.
Oh, okay.
Right, and then he also took congressmen and other people to Turkey on a trip, and that wasn't supposed to be done, except with the exception that it be paid for by the Turkish government, and that was arranged. Okay, so and then he also operated his office. That he got a special office as Speaker of the House when he left government for 5 years to operate this Speaker's office in his hometown, and it's only supposed to be used for government purposes in order to wrap up the affairs of the Speaker, right? He also, allegations are that he ran his lobbying business out of that too. So he's not totally without a history. Mm.
To answer your basic question, though, is yes, there are different patterns of corruption. For instance, the part we've been talking about is congressional corruption. Mm-hmm. Congressional corruption tends to involve sexual affairs, like Mel Reynolds, Gus Savage, and Hastert has been accused of now. Mm-hmm. In addition, it involves the kind of corruption Tom was just describing, the normal conflicts of interest, say of Rostenkowski. But we found corruption at the state level. We found aldermanic corruption. We found city and county employee corruption. We found, more interesting for most viewers perhaps, because it's not usually understood, significant suburban corruption. Yeah. We found nearly 200 cases of suburban officials who are corrupt and have been convicted by the federal government in 60 different suburbs. And the suburbs seem to be vying to see how many they can increase that number to. There's some we know about, like Cicero and Rosemont and so forth, that are constantly in the news, Niles, but there are many others that aren't normally thought of as corrupt. We think of it, it's the evil city that's corrupt, but the nice, clean suburbs, but that's simply not true.
This has been a big new opportunity for the BGA since
they've done an excellent job. We need to create suburban inspector generals. Mm-hmm. We found police corruption, including the kind of abuse of John Burge, but also the police have changed their pattern. They no longer take bribes from the mob to the police superintendent or the commander. Now the bribes are much more retail. They're direct from the street gangs to the local beat cop or to the special units that get assigned to drugs and to gangs. So yes, we found patterns of corruption, and each different pattern has a different solution. And you were asking about the newer forms. The newer form seems to be the white-collar corruption in contracts. One of my favorite lines from a newspaper at the turn of the 20th century was that corruption was written as thievery between the lines of the contracts. The contracts have more than conflicts of interest, they have outright stealing.
I wanted to sort of return at some point back to this sort of overarching theme of mine of what kinds of corruption are there, because you mentioned the police. One of the kinds of corruption doesn't involve really money, or often doesn't involve money at all. It's a kind of power corruption of being able to say, yes, I'm going to take you into this dark room and you won't be seen again because I have that kind of power. That's corruption.
And it ended up costing the city more than $100 million in reparations. It ended up undermining faith in the police department. So no one's going to report a crime if you think the police are really out to beat black people.
Yeah.
You just won't do it. It just doesn't make sense if that's your view of the police. And that's part of the legacy of the Burge period and so many cops who used their office to abuse people they thought might be involved in a crime.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we often get asked is, well, there's rogue policemen, they're doing things they're not supposed to be doing. How is that political corruption? Well, it is a fact that many of these things are covered up by the organization. The cover-up.
It's often the cover-up.
The cover-up is political corruption. Also, there's a culture of allowing people to operate whichever way they want to operate until they get caught and it's in the press. All right, and so that's the problem with a number of institutions. We have the same problem I think with the school board, as you have with the police department, of not really having a top-down commitment to honest and fair service. All right, the commitment is, get the immediate job done and let people do it whatever way they want.
Well, that level of personal corruption it varies from discipline, but it's really the same thing. It's the building inspector on the take who overlooks a corroded hanger on a back porch for $50, and then that porch collapses a year later and kills people.
Part of the cost.
It's corruption. It's just there are so many different flavors of corruption.
And the underlying theme of our book is that most of this goes back to a long history of machine politics, which began in Chicago in 1871. That history created a series of acts, so there were all these small corruptions and big corruptions going back to the 19th century and continuing up through the Blagojevich era and the rest. And that once that starts, then if you're a public official, you expect me to bribe you to give me whatever building inspector's pass or whatever. In turn, I expect to have to bribe you. And therefore we collaborate, we continue a pattern, and changing that pattern will take us decades because it's taken us 150 years of this practice of corruption, creating expectation and a culture of corruption.
Now, I don't mean to turn this, to a humor vein here, but I think there were some, to me, rather funny incidents that happened at the very birth of our great city. I mean, what were they? The Articles of Incorporation. That was fiddled too.
Yeah, we did two important votes back in 1833 and then again in 1837. And when we did the first vote to incorporate the city as a town, we weren't big enough. We had they cast their votes to yes, incorporate, and what they found was they were meeting in a tavern, which was very appropriate to Chicago. It was a hotel tavern.
It's a hotel tavern. Okay,
so it made it different. There was one building. It was a log cabin that had a bar, and so when they counted the votes, they got more votes than there were citizens in the town. And then when they elected the aldermen and the trustees, they found that a number of people voted who weren't eligible to vote. So it's ghost voting started in 1833 in the city of Chicago.
Sounds a bit like Deadwood, but
yeah. And then in 1869, just after the Civil War, the first, we had corruption scandals before that were civil trials, and we can go back to them in 1856 and so forth. But in 1869, City Hall was a wooden structure like this table.
I love this story.
And so it needed a paint job, just like any wooden house does, except it's a big building. So they hired someone for $127,000 to paint City Hall.
Are you sure you got that right?
I am absolutely
$27,000.
About $12,700,000 a day or something like that. A huge multiple.
I mean, they could have just torn it down and built something out of marble for that.
That would have been a good idea.
Yeah.
They did that a little later.
Yeah, right.
So anyway, they hired this contractor. He doesn't use paint, he used whitewash. A couple of rainstorms later, it's obvious to everyone.
Corruption is not funny.
Yeah,
Remember
right.
that, boys and girls.
Try that. And then, so they indicted 14 aldermen and county commissioners because it was a city-county building. They convicted 4 of them, sent them to jail. Most of the others lost their election in 1871 in the reform after the fire. But it's, we have been corrupt since we were a territory.
Since we were just a gleam in our daddy's eye.
There we are.
So then I don't want to spend too much time on this because we do have important things to talk about, but you know, as a kid, you read these glowing stories about, you know, the aftermath of the fire and how the city fathers got together and they said, this will not stand. We will rise this city from the ashes. And everyone came together in the town square. They all agreed on what to do, and then they went about like busy bees and rebuilt the city, and it's what we have today. You have a kind of a seamier view of that.
Another group got together at the same time.
In that tavern.
Well, a different one, because this one was owned by Michael Cassius MacDonald. Michael Cassius MacDonald was a gambler who had come up from where he was on the trains and stealing money in the regular way. He had founded a saloon. It was on Clark Street and downtown. And what he did was he introduced the saloon keepers and the brothel keepers to the politicians and showed them they had a common self-interest.
And they did.
The saloon keepers would give out beer and lunch to any good citizen like yourself who would ride on the wagon around on election day and vote in 5 places. In addition, the saloon keepers gave gifts to the aldermen, and they also gave campaign contributions. Same for the brothel keepers. And they then convinced the politicians got elected aldermen, and the aldermen and ward committeemen prevented the police from raiding these fine business establishments of Chicago, particularly down on the levee where people like Hinky Dink and Bathhouse John were holding forth a little later after the first machines were formed. But
and
that was that long ago,
and
1871.
You move it up to the Al Capone days. Al Capone left Chicago to go to Cicero when Big Bill Thompson was out of office for 4 years. Right? He wanted Big Bill Thompson to come back. He provided campaign donations, large campaign donations. He also provided election day workers to get Big Bill Thompson elected mayor. So we've had, you know, corruption in elections. We have corruption with mobs and gangsters. You know, even up to very recent decades, we've had accusations of street gangs being involved in election processes. So these things go on.
I was just going to say that's a lesson that Rahm Emanuel learned. He didn't have enough street workers, and
Right.
he had to fix that on his second.
And that's
go-round.
changing. And that's changing corruption.
It is.
And
It is.
we can get into that a little.
You know, I'm so crazy about the fact we only have like 10 minutes left. There's a completely off the wall question I wanted to ask you. Forgive me for this, but can you talk about the 1970 the redo of the Constitution in Illinois and put that in terms of corruption and how it changed things? Because it seems to me that you mentioned, for example, that in the city council there have been only 200 human beings have sat in the city council since 1970.
Up until the last few elections,
Didn't it sort of cement the idea that you can keep these jobs forever?
Yeah. And of those 200 people, 33 went to jail, and 3 others would have if they hadn't died from illness before they could be tried. So we have, the way I usually put that is the most dangerous criminal area in the state of Illinois is two places: the city council chambers with its enormous corruption rate, and the governor's mansion. And 4 of the last 9 governors have gone to jail. So that's nearly a 50% chance of being involved in a crime in the governor's mansion, and about a 30% chance in the city council chambers. But yes, the 1970 Constitution actually did do a number of improvements. And the reason for that is the Democrats and the Republicans were about evenly divided. And there were 13 independents like Don Clark Netsch, Bernie Weisberg, and others who were the independents, and they held the balance of power. So some areas of the Constitution, like the human rights section of the Constitution, the revenue section that gave us home rule, and other sections were an improvement. The part which would have helped a good bit, which was to have made a merit selection of judges instead of elected judges, was voted down by the voters because the machines, particularly the Democratic machine, were dead set against allowing a process of someone qualified going on the bench instead of someone powerful.
So there was a debate about that then?
Oh yeah, it was actually one of the 4 amendments that was voted separately, and if we had passed it, one of the sections you're talking about the patterns of corruption, we have a whole section on just the corruption in the courts, particularly with the Gaylord investigation and the Gambit investigation.
It's a complete disrespect to both of you guys to jump around like this, but let's talk about digital corruption and the modern day. We get this impression now that I'm impressed by a lot of younger people, 20-something type people, who will sit there and tell me all steely-eyed that corruption can't happen anymore because now we have databases. We can see corruption as it happens and we can root it right out.
Not true. We have databases.
Oh, no.
That part's true.
A lot of stuff's not in the databases. There's a relatively recent story which I find amazing. There was a woman who worked for the city government who was in charge of giving out permits for trucks that needed to be parked in the public way for a certain period of time. And they had to pay a fee for these permits, right? Well, she put these checks. The checks were written out to a couple of initials and then dash her name, right? She entered them in her own personal checking account, all right? Now, one can understand that there's corruption, right? But how many other points of entry are there in the city of Chicago for checks or for payments? And who's watching them?
And the amazing story was Rita Crunwell, who was at Dixon, Illinois.
The gold standard.
She stole $53 million. Nobody knew there was $53 million in Dixon, and she did the same thing. She had the checks made out to an entity that looked like a government entity and put it in her personal checking account.
You've been the mayor when he got that phone call that morning. Oh, Mr. Mayor, we found $53 million.
Was stolen. They didn't get it back. They got about $20 million back when the feds sold off her property, including 400 horses and her vacation home in Florida and the like.
Okay, so we're in the lightning round now, as they say.
And so there is data, but it's like a fire hose of data. It's not available in a way that a newsman like yourself could look at the data and tell something was going on. Most of the corruption, a lot of the corruption now is in things like the crooked contracts, like the pay-to-play that was in the Blagojevich administration with the pension funds. Those would not, all you would have is that this agency got the contract. You wouldn't know that the contract was corrupt and they were paying off Stuart Levin and the rest of them.
Help me out here. I'm going through a personal crisis of confidence. I have never been in favor of term limits. I'm starting to think that maybe that's what we have to do. Maybe we need to.
I advocated them when I ran against Rostenkowski. I think they are what we list are 8 different proposals that have to all be enacted, or most of them have to be enacted. Term limits, fixing the gerrymandering of maps with a fair map process are one of them. Better transparency and accountability is the easiest. The hardest is destroying the political machines, both here and in DuPage County, as the Republican machine and so forth. One that we can vote on today, the governor has on his desk a bill to sign HB 4205, which would require civics to be taught in schools. That's passed by overwhelming majorities in both houses of the legislature. Your viewers can weigh in on that, and the governor signing that would be one step forward. It's about the only one coming out of this legislative session.
One of the best things that has happened in recent years, and we endorse it fully in our book, is the emergence of inspector generals and the effect that a truly independent inspector general on a government can have. And we've seen that.
We have seen that.
Now, recently in Chicago, we've seen it. They have a pretty good inspector general at the school board now. The suburbs don't have one. We're recommending that the suburbs get together and hire an inspector general. And also, Sheriff Tom Dart has offered his department to help some of the Cook County suburbs with it. But people ought to insist on independent inspector generals, independent auditors, transparency of where the money's going. And one of the other developments that we've seen happen is the corruption has switched from patronage, mainly because we haven't talked about it, but the Shachtman decree over a period of years has lessened the impact of patronage. The corruption has shifted to contracts and to what's called pinstripe patronage, all right? The problem with that is many of the things that are costing us money that are done wrong are not considered illegal. You take a look at the contract to Soups from the Board of Education, or $20 million, no bid contract, all right? Whether it's out and out corruption is one thing, all right? But it certainly was a poor decision, a stupid decision.
And it needs accountability.
And also the benefit to the school students and to the principals and to the teachers wasn't there, and it was evidence that it wasn't there, right?
So I'm really sorry that we're running just completely out of time here. I formulated a final question for you. Which is more corrupt? Governor Ryan walking around with his hand out looking for $20 bills to congratulate him for his birthday, or the boys carving up the city council into new gerrymandered wards? Which is worse?
Well, it's a tough one. Both are wrong. The gerrymandering perverts the process. I think the one we would probably all decide is that simply taking money is the most evil.
Just taking money. Right? There's nothing's more wrong than just sticking your hand out.
The definition of corruption is using your public office for private gain.
But actually, the gerrymandering has a longer term impact.
Oh, yes, it does.
Right? And it goes on for years and years and years. And also, it's something can really be done about it. Whereas you can't
the other
really
is
do
just
something.
Human nature.
Particularly in the state.
We just have to stop it right here. Stop talking.
Let's stop corruption.
The book is called Corrupt Illinois, and the features are patronage, cronyism, and criminality. And our experts on it, of course, are right here in the studio with us. These authors right here, Tom Gradel and Dick Simpson. And we've really enjoyed having you here. I wish we could talk for another 3 hours, and maybe we will one day. You've been watching Chicago Newsroom thanks to these guys. It's a community service of CAN TV. You can find us here on cable anytime you want, or you can watch us right here at your desire, at your time and your speed. And we'll be back next week with another program right here on Chicago Newsroom. I'm Ken Davis. Thanks very much, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Great.